So I'm going to talk about gender equality in South Africa, and what I want to talk about is the formal guarantees of gender equality, and then a little bit more about what's really happening on the ground in South Africa, and how South Africa's efforts are being perceived by the international community. So I'm going to start off. So South Africa, as you've heard, has this wonderful constitution that came into effect in 1996. And that has broad guarantees of equality and an extensive Bill of Rights. And it guarantees the rights of women as well in multiple ways. But I'm going to argue today that women are a step behind. That the rights of women have not fully been realized in South Africa, that formal gender protection exists, but on the ground there's a different story being played out. And that different story relates in part to what my friend Vinod was talking about, social and economic rights. So the legal protection is there, the realization of those rights, not so much. So you've heard a lot about the Equality Clause in Article 9 of the Constitution. And so those of us from the United States, it's our Equal Protection Clause, essentially, with some additional components. So everyone's equal before the law. Okay, we can understand that. But what the South African Constitution purported to do was to go on and elaborate what South Africa understands by equality. Okay, so full and equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms. And then this subsection 2 here is what we would call an affirmative action clause. So it recognizes that many people in South Africa were disadvantaged by the apartheid system, and disadvantage is such a underwhelming term for what actually took place during apartheid. But they're sort of saying people who were previously disadvantaged can be prioritized, or their interests can be advanced in this new dispensation. And then they also have what I think American students would find sort of curious. Their discrimination, protection from discrimination is extensive. Okay, so it's not just that the state is prohibited from discriminating against people, and any organs of the state are prohibited from discriminating against people. But no person may unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone. Okay. So not just public discrimination, but private discrimination is explicitly prohibited in this constitution. And if you look at the grounds that are given protection from discrimination, so the obvious ones, I think to us, race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color. So remember, this is 1996, sexual orientation. Okay, so I mean, in the United States, we've just had the Supreme Court, sort of permitting gay marriage. In 1996, South Africa was saying we're not permitting any form of discrimination on any of these grounds, either by the state or by private individuals. So really advanced for that time. And there's also provision that discrimination is unfair unless you can prove that it's fair. So there's some burden shifting as to who bears the onus of proof in the Constitution. Okay, so there are also additional protections that I think really help advance the cause of women's rights, at least in a formal sense. So very few constitutions talk about the concept of human dignity. But the South African Constitution explicitly guarantees the inherent dignity and the right of all people to have their dignity protected and respected. Okay, and then, and I think this is when I'm going to talk about, particularly with regards to women, particularly relevant, the right to be free from all forms of violence, whether public or private. Okay, so not just violence at the hands of the state, but violence by an individual person against another individual person. And that is a right articulated in the Bill of Rights. So you've heard a little bit about customary law today. So sort of customary law is acknowledged and guaranteed that people can practice customary law and resolve disputes under customary law. but there's specific articles that require customary law be consistent with the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And then there are other, what we call socio-economic rights, I think. Housing, education, healthcare, including reproductive healthcare, the right to sufficient food and water. And then the Constitutional Court has articulated what we call progressive realization jurisprudence, which relates to these rights, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So aside from all those extensive rights, especially if you consider those compared to the United States Constitution, the Constitution of South Africa actually creates these organizations which are called Chapter 9 organizations. And one of them is the Commission for Gender Equality. So they haven't just created these rights and said, oh, you know, everyone has the right to equality and everyone has the right to have their dignity respected. They've actually created an institution that focuses on gender equality. And that institution has articulated various, what they call themes, okay? And I think it's no accident that the first theme that they articulated was gender and poverty, and the relationship between gender and poverty. So if you're a woman, I think this is probably true across the world, but particularly true in Africa, you are much more likely to be poor than if you're a man, okay, for multiple reasons. And then gender and HIV. So some people might say, well, what is the connection there? So unfortunately, women in South Africa are the fastest rising groups who are likely to become infected with HIV or AIDS. Okay? So gender and HIV is a huge cause of concern, and especially because women often transmit HIV positive status to their unborn children, or to children who they have already given birth through breastfeeding. Okay, so their third thing is what they call the national gender machinery. So when I see that, I don't know, I get these weird images of tanks or something like that. But it's a term used by the United Nations that basically says, are there institutions and organizations that concern themselves with advancing gender equality? Okay, so what is the machinery? What is in place in terms of institutions and organizations that advance gender equality? And then another cause of concern, obviously, gender-based violence, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. Gender, culture, and religious practices. So are they discriminatory towards women in any sense? And then what is the relationship between gender, democracy, and good governance? Okay, so there are all these guarantees of equality, protections against discrimination, institutions in place to guarantee and promote gender equality. And so it behooves us now to kind of look on the ground in South Africa and say, okay, formal protections are clearly in place. What is actually happening in terms of women's rights? So people have been taking gender claims to the Constitutional Court. So there have been several significant cases that advance women's rights. So one case, Bay, found that African customary law of inheritance discriminates against women because under customary law, women are pretty much precluded from inheriting. That goes to the eldest male heir who steps into the shoes of the deceased. So women are essentially cut out of access to assets. They're the right of non-resident spouses to reside in South Africa. So often if some, and it's, in this case was a woman who was married to a South African man, and her right to reside in South Africa was dependent on the discretion of the official who made those decisions. So that case was taken to the Constitutional Court. Carmichael case dealt with protecting women from rape. Okay, so remember the Constitution guarantees the right of people to be free from violence, whether public or private. In the Carmichael case, there was a known rapist and sex offender who had been charged with multiple sex offences and applied for bail when he was charged with rape. And the police and the prosecutor didn't oppose him being granted bail, even though he had past convictions for sexual offences and was being charged with rape. And he went out and raped this woman who, her neighbour had in fact called the police on several occasions and said, this man is casing my house, he's outside, I know who he is, he's a convicted rapist, and please put him in jail, you know, why is he out on bail? and he in fact raped this woman, and she successfully brought a claim before the Constitutional Court saying the Constitution guarantees me the right to be free from violence. And then the Minister of Health case, a group of pregnant women and various other people sued the Minister of Health for access to antiretroviral drugs in order to prevent them from transferring their HIV positive status to their unborn children. And they were successful in that case. Yeah. So we have good protections articulated in the Constitution, machinery in place to enforce and guarantee those, a constitutional court that's willing to make decisions that favor gender rights. What could go wrong? Okay. I know Bernard, I believe, referenced Mrs. Grootboom, who brought a case to the Constitutional Court when her shack was destroyed. And she said the Constitution guarantees a right to housing. Okay. Her shack had been destroyed to make place for a housing project, and I mean, you can see the conditions in which she had been living. And although the Constitutional Court says, okay, we recognize the Constitution says you have this right to housing, we have to understand that that right can't just be implemented right away. That the government has to be able to pay for these things. This seems to be a constant theme that Judith alluded to. The government has to be able to pay for those things. It can't just give you a house. It cannot just turn around and, sort of say you're entitled to a house. So yes, you're entitled to housing, but there's this progressive realization of that right, that it will be enforced and implemented as the government is able to do that. It takes a while to construct housing, and unfortunately, as you heard, she died before she could achieve the realization of her right, even though she was successful in her claim. And another thing that case brings to mind to me, so she was looking after a number of children. She was living there with a number of children, who she also claimed had no adequate food and water as well, which again are guaranteed by the Constitution. And it's often the case that those gender stereotype roles remain, that women are the caregivers for children. Okay? Women are charged with looking after these children, providing them with food, providing them with housing, providing them with nutrition, water, all of those things. And so even though the Constitution protects customary law and recognizes customary law as a valid legal system, customary law recognizes polygamy. And to me, that is a huge problem. And so our current president, President Zuma, is a polygamist. He has multiple wives. And the Constitution does not prohibit polygamy. The legislation has tried to regulate it in that it's requiring people to register customary law marriages if you're going to enter into a polygamous marriage, and to tell the court how your property is going to devolve on your death. So if you're a male polygamist and you have multiple wives, you are supposed to go to the court and explain to them what legal system is going to be invoked to divide up your assets when you die. But I really believe that polygamy is in part responsible for the poverty of women. I'm not saying across the board, but I think that if one male provider dies, okay, and there is a polygamous union, then multiple women and multiple children are going to be impoverished by the death of that one person. And so the Maputo Protocol, which is part of the African Charter on People and Human and People's Rights, actually says monogamy is the preferred form of marriage. It doesn't outlaw polygamy, but it sort of asserts that monogamy is preferable, and I think in part because of this relation of women and poverty, and that women who are in polygamous unions are much more likely to be left in poverty when the spouse dies, the male spouse dies. Okay, so that aside, South Africa has these protections in place. It has machinery in place to monitor gender equality. And I think it's pretty good, and I would argue probably better than the United States, about looking at equality in the judiciary and looking at equality in public life. And those of you who heard the Justice yesterday, he conceded that the judiciary is still predominantly male. Okay, so, but at least they are tracking how many women are in the judiciary in the High Court divisions. And I think really interestingly enough, in light of conversations that I've had with various people, they're also tracking by race as well. So under apartheid, South Africa had a very, obviously, stringent race-based system, but you were either Indian or you were colored, which I know is an offensive word to our American students, but it means basically a person of mixed blood, or you were black. And it seems really strange to me that we're still tracking representation in the judiciary along those same lines, as well as along male and female lines. But they haven't done badly. They've made some progress, certainly not equality, but definitely made some progress in the judiciary. And there have been some astounding women leaders. Okay, so there are many female ministers in South Africa. Women in parliament are much more equally represented, certainly, than women in the Senate in the United States or women in Congress. And these two women, there are countless women, including my colleagues here, who I could have put up on the screen, but these two women, so this is Navi Pillay, who graduated from law school and couldn't get a job because she was a woman of color and a woman, and started her own law practice and went on to become this incredibly distinguished lawyer who then went on to become a judge of the Tribunal for Rwanda, the United Nations Tribunal for Rwanda. And Justice Madanga talked yesterday about the personal attributes of justice and judges, and how you bring who you are as a judge to the bench, and how that informs your decision. And so when Justice Pillay was a judge on the Tribunal for Rwanda, she was adjudicating this case, and she was listening to these witnesses testify about genocide in Rwanda, and she thought to herself that all these women witnesses who were coming forward were testifying about their rapes, but almost incidentally, So sort of describing these events and saying, and yes, and then I was raped, and then this happened and that happened, and everyone was killed except for these, few of us who survived. And so Judge Pillay basically stopped proceedings, and she said to the prosecutor, why haven't you charged rape in these cases? And so the prosecutor went back and sort of came up with charges that included rape. And so in part, her contribution as a woman sensitized to those things, kind of changed the law of rape, because we have an expanded definition and some really important human rights jurisprudence coming from the Rwandan Tribunal as a result of her work. And she went on to become the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights. She's conducting an investigation in South Africa. She's done incredible things to advance the cause of human rights. And that was someone who wasn't deemed worthy of job after graduating from law school. And then you've heard people talk about the public protector in the Nkandla case recently, and she, that's Tudi Mansela, she basically stood up to the president and said, no, you have to pay this money back, this money that you have taken from the taxpayers and used to, create this lavish house for yourself. This needs to be repaid. So there are incredible women of courage who have taken positions and sort of advanced the cause of women's rights and justice and equality generally with regard to the public protector. Okay, but the downside. Okay, so United Nations conducted this survey, and they basically found that in South Africa, a woman or a child is raped every 26 seconds. Okay, so look at that beautiful constitutional provision that guarantees protection from violence, whether public or private. So the incidence of rape in South Africa, I think, has probably been surpassed by DRC and places like that, but is one of the highest incidents of rape in the world. So a constitution that has an explicit protection from violence, public or private, has one of the highest incidents of rape in the world. And not only that, not only rape, but murder as well. So violence against women in the form of assault, violence against women in the form of actually killing them. And it's not a race issue, it's not a class issue, and there are people who have argued that apartheid is responsible because people feel emasculated because the apartheid government, took away any power. It's not, as you can see, a matter of race. It's I don't even know what it is. I can't even begin to address that. And I'm sure the apartheid regime holds responsibility for emasculating people and from disempowering them. But that can no longer be used as a justification for the high rates of violence against women and for the high rates of rape of women and children. And the United Nations has recognized that violence is a form of discrimination against women. South Africa is a signatory to CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that recognizes that violence is a form of discrimination. And yet South Africa has one of the highest rates of violence against women. So again, assessing it by international standards, because the Constitutional Court explicitly says that it may take international law into account and may even take the jurisprudence of other countries into account. So the United Nations had these Millennium Development Goals that were supposed to be achieved by 2015. And one of those 8 goals was gender equality, achieve gender equality. Okay, 2015 has come and gone. So the new, part of the new agenda for sustainable development is Planet 50/50. Okay, so are things going to be shared evenly between the genders? And so the goal is by 2030 we'll achieve Planet 50/50. Okay. South Africa is endorsed this, so part of working towards this by 2030. There's also the World Economic Forum each year issues what they call the Global Gender Gap Index, and they rank countries like how big is the gender divide in that country between men and women based on 4 primary criteria. So labor force participation, educational attainment, health, and political empowerment. Okay. So South Africa ranks 17th out of 145 countries surveyed, which is pretty good. It's one of the top African countries. I think Namibia beat it out. But I believe the United States ranked 28th in 2015 out of 145 countries. So if we look at South Africa, we can say, oh look, they're really doing well in the Global Gender Gap Index. There isn't much difference between the access to resources and the labor force participation, educational attainment between men and women. But if you break down those numbers a little more closely, you notice a certain unsettling theme or trend. Okay, so South Africa in 2009 was ranked 6th out of all countries on the Global Gender Gap. Now we're ranked 17. Okay, so why? Well, we only rank 72 in terms of labor force participation by women. Okay, so women are in the labor force, but a lot of women are doing unpaid labor. So they're working in subsistence farming, they're trying to cobble together things for themselves, they're working in the home, they're raising children, they're doing all of those things, and they're not doing paid labor. And what does that mean? They're more likely to be poor. They're more likely not to have any pension or any kind of provision for their own retirement. Okay? So women and poverty, one of the themes, just keeps recurring. Educational attainment. So Judith referred to this. South Africa ranks 85th out of 145 countries. Okay? Not something to be proud of in terms of access of women and girls to education. They're not achieving that at the same rate as men. So in terms of health, there is no gender disparity essentially between men and women. Okay, but when you again break down those numbers, why is that? So when the United Nations, when the World Economic Forum is looking at health, they look at average age of death of women, average age of death of men. Okay, and they look at South Africa and they say women can have a healthy life expectancy up to age 54. Okay, which is not too distant for some of us. And men only have a healthy life expectancy to age 49. How distressing is that? Okay, so even though South Africa ranks highly on that particular index, because women outlive men generally, it's not a very long life for either sex. Okay, South Africa does do well with regard to political empowerment. They rank 14 out of countries in the world because they do have good representation of women in parliament and as ministers as well in the government. Okay. But again, some disturbing trends. So women average 257 minutes per day in unpaid work. So over 4 hours, women are spent, doing unpaid work, while men only spend about an hour and a half doing unpaid work. Okay. So those gender stereotype roles have not changed. Women are still primarily responsible for children, for the house, for doing all of those things. And only 13% of listed companies, so sort of the equivalent of our Fortune 500 companies, have women on their board. So again, women being kind of shut out of the higher echelons of powers. But most concerning, I think, women do not have equal access to land or other resources. And that's not just an equality or justice issue. So there have been multiple studies done that if women have access to land, or if women have access to economic resources, they're more likely to educate themselves, educate their children. They're more likely to leave a situation that involves domestic violence because they have choices they can provide for themselves and their children. They're more likely to make better choices about nourishing their children. And they themselves are more likely to be healthy because if they're suffering from TB or malaria or HIV, they're more likely to seek treatment. So it's not an equality and justice issue, although obviously it is. It's a sustainable development issue. So when I think about, the sort of prospects for South Africa, yes, they've accomplished a lot. Yes, the formal protections are yet there. The machinery of achieving those protections and enforcing those protections are there. But there's still major concerns. So the HIV/AIDS rates among women. Okay. These gender stereotype roles where girls have to get the water, that might keep them out of school. Lack of access to clean water, lack of access to food, lack of access to adequate housing, lack of equal access to education, and then violence against women. Okay. And that to me is the most troubling out of all of those, like poverty and violence. I think if you take two themes about the situation of women in South Africa today, those would be the two that I would ask you to take. And I know Roger was, in his presentation this morning, was sort of bringing back, and Garth will remember, it's like old struggle slogans when, power. So one of the things that we used to say when we were law students and still living under the apartheid system was that the struggle continues, a luta continua. So I would say for women, very much so, the struggle continues.